Good evening. A late-breaking story from Bridgewater tonight. 3 men have staged a dramatic escape from the Bridgewater State Prison.
The siren sounded late tonight as a trio of armed robbery suspects made their break. And tonight, a massive search is on to find them. News Center 5 has learned all 3 of the men were in prison for armed robbery. They are Robert Martin, who's described as a white male, 23 years of age, 5 feet 8, 180 pounds. RICARDO BORGES, 19 years of age, a white male, 5 feet 3, weighing 140. And Jason COSTA, 21 years of age, a white male, 5 feet 5, 170 pounds. There's no word exactly on how they escaped. The last prison break at Bridgewater was Halloween night of last year, when 2 convicted murderers escaped and terrorized the town for weeks. Trick-or-treating celebrations were canceled in the town. Both men were later found hiding out in Cambridge, just blocks away from a police station. We have a crew at Bridgewater tonight and hope to bring you a live update on the situation in a few minutes.
Now an update on our top story. 3 inmates have escaped from the medium security prison at Bridgewater. News Center 5 Steve Sprasia is live at the prison tonight and has the latest on that story. Steve?
Well, Chetel, the 3 inmates apparently escaped from the Southeast Correctional Facility about 8:30 this evening. Bridgewater police tell us tonight they weren't notified till about 9:30. And then when one of their officers went to the scene, he was only given the name of one of the escapees. 3 apparently escaped, all according to the Corrections Department, serving time for armed robbery. Now, Bridgewater police are having roving patrols right now in town. In addition, state police are also out, and the correctional facility people have put up what they call posted officers at various locations around town looking for the 3 suspects. The 3 suspects who escaped, all in their 20s, they are as follows. The 3 individuals who escaped tonight, they are Robert Martin. He is 5 foot 8. He is 24 years old, allegedly serving time for armed robbery. 20-year-old RICARDO BORGES, also serving time for armed robbery, according to the Corrections Department. And the 3rd suspect, 21-year-old Jason COSTA, again, supposed to be serving time for armed robbery. But as one of the police officers on the desk here at the Bridgewater Police Department told us, one of those inmates was serving 30 years. He said that's not a sentence for 30 years. And there's apparently some confusion over the charges that the 3 were serving time on. So they're not sure if the armed robbery was the only thing they were serving time on. At this point, the search is ongoing throughout most of Bridgewater. Again, 3 suspects escaping about 8:30 from the Southeast Correctional Facility here in Bridgewater. State police, Bridgewater police, and corrections officials all looking for them. With this live report from Bridgewater, I'm Steve Sprasia, News Center 5 tonight. Chet?
Steve, any idea why Corrections Department officials took an hour to notify the local authorities?
Well, last Halloween, you might recall, there was another escape from the very same facility, and again, there was some confusion as to how long it took the police department to be notified here in Bridgewater. In fact, the desk officer told us he had to get his information from a teletype from the state police in Framingham. As I indicated, when his officer went to the scene, they only gave him the name of one individual. There seems to be a communications problem that's ongoing, not just with this escape, but with others, too. That according to the Bridgewater police chat.
All right, Steve.
3 prison escapees have been captured this morning in Dartmouth. It happened within the last few minutes. They escaped from the Southeast Correctional Center in Bridgewater last night. The men apparently made their escape through a ceiling in their cell between 8 and 9 o'clock last night. They went through the roof and then hoisted themselves over the wall with a rope made of bed sheets. The men were serving time for crimes including armed robbery and assault with a dangerous weapon. We will have a live report from the scene later in this half hour. But they are back in custody this morning, found in Dartmouth. Mike Macklin is on the scene in Bridgewater right now with late details. Mike, good morning.
John, those 3 inmates are now back in custody. They are at the State Police Barracks in Dartmouth, and they are, of course, being questioned and processed there and will be returned to the custody of the Massachusetts correctional officials. The capture came at about 8:30, 8:15 this morning, which puts that capture within the past hour or so. And the capture happened down in New Bedford. Acting on a tip, investigators went to a housing project in New Bedford. They had an idea of an apartment where they might find at least one of the escaped inmates. And investigators, I'm told, looked in the window, saw one of the escaped prisoners sitting in the kitchen. At that point, they broke down the door and went into the apartment, and once inside, found not just one, but all 3 of the escapees. The capture came without incident. No shots were fired. No officers were injured. And at this point, the 3 inmates, as we say, are back in custody and are at the State Police Barracks in Dartmouth being processed. Now, it was last night that they made their escape from the Southeast Correctional Center in Bridgewater. The 3 inmates were all considered dangerous. They include 23-year-old Robert Martin, who was serving time for armed robbery, 20-year-old RICARDO BORGES serving time for assault and battery, and 21-year-old Jason COSTA, who was serving time for armed robbery. With me now is Tony Carnevale from the Corrections Department. Tony, first let's go back to last night, the escape. We understand it happened at around 8:30 or so. When was it discovered, and what do you believe happened?
Well, there's a regular count of inmates at 9 o'clock each night at Southeastern Correctional Center. It was during that count of inmates that a correction officer noticed that a cell that she was checking on was empty. Entered the cell, found that a portion of the ceiling had been removed, a plaster and wood ceiling. That facility is about 100 years old in some parts of the building, so the ceiling is not very strong. They also broke through the actual roof of the facility. The cell was on the highest tier, on the 4th level. It appears the inmate, at least in that cell, and obviously the other two at that point, had climbed through the roof, climbing across a couple of the buildings and then down a wall by using the classic sheets tied together, used as a rope, dangling about 4 feet off the ground and then made off.
How is it that someone would be able to get a hole going right through the ceiling of the cell without being noticed? I would expect that would take some time.
Well, that's something we're obviously looking into and investigating. There were some homemade tools that were found, but again, the ceiling there, not exactly the strongest or the newest type of construction. Again, it was plaster and wood, and however long they were working on that, we're not sure, but we will determine that, and we'll take the appropriate steps in the future.
What about notification with the community? Apparently there was some questions, some concern last night about when the escape was discovered and how the notification process went.
Sure. We first began to discover the fact that these inmates might have escaped minutes after 9 o'clock. At 9:15, an emergency was declared at the complex, at the Bridgewater complex. Within 15 minutes of that emergency declaration, Bridgewater police officials were notified, state police. It was within 15 minutes. I've seen the chronology, and proper notification went out in response to the last October's escape at Old Colony, just down the road there at the complex. We redrafted some policies, procedures, notifications, and we're pleased with the way things went. Swift notification for the town.
Okay, and of course it was fairly swift work by the investigators, by corrections officers and state police. Within about 12 hours after the escape, they had located the escaped inmates, and they are all now back in custody, with that capture coming early this morning down in New Bedford. Mike Macklin reporting live from Bridgewater. John, back to you.
One of the stories making headlines this Saturday, police now have captured 3 fugitive convicts who escaped from a Massachusetts state prison last night. They reportedly found the 3 in an apartment in New Bedford and arrested them without any problems less than 12 hours after they escaped. They are in custody at the Mass Correctional Institute at Cedar Junction in Walpole. That's a maximum security facility. Police say the 3 escaped from the state prison in Bridgewater by using a rope made of bed sheets to scale the prison's walls. The 3 are serving time for charges including armed robbery and assault with a dangerous weapon.
Good evening. It was a prison escape right out of the movies. Last night, 3 convicts at Bridgewater's Southeastern Correctional Prison tied their bed sheets together and hoisted themselves out of the ceiling of their cells. Perhaps it would have been the great escape they had planned had it not been for quick action by state and local police. News Center 5's Pam Cross reports.
The 3 inmates went from AWOL to arrest in a matter of hours. Following their capture, the men were brought to Cedar Junction, the state's maximum security prison in Walpole. A squad of state police and corrections officers located the 3 hiding out here at this New Bedford address, the home of a female friend. One man tried to run out the back.
They placed him under arrest immediately. The other 2 parties in the basement were in hiding, and they had to be restrained and taken out of there.
We were following up leads developed through reviewing the institutional records and street interviews, and one of the leads was to that house.
20-year-old RICARDO BORGES, only 2 months from a parole hearing, was serving time for burglary. Both 23-year-old Robert Martin and 21-year-old Jason COSTA were jailed for armed robbery. Last night, state police stopped cars in the Bridgewater area while they searched for the men. They apparently had a plan and some help. They chipped away at a ceiling in one inmate's cell and used toilet paper to camouflage the hole.
The inmate was on a corner cell here right next to a column of stairwells, managed to punch through the roof, jumped onto the top of this small tower. The inmates ran across this building here.
Roping bed sheets together, they climbed down and away.
That 4th tier is less secure than we had thought in the past, so we're in the process now of evaluating the situation. Obviously, it shows the need for a capital plan so we can replace these 125-year-old cells.
Last Halloween night, 2 convicted murderers escaped from a different medium security prison in the same Bridgewater complex. They were arrested a month later. The three could be here in maximum security for a while. They're probably looking at longer sentences, too. The district attorney will review their breakout and is expected to press charges for escape. In Walpole, I'm Pam Cross, News Center 5.
3 inmates from the state prison in Bridgewater are behind bars tonight after 12 hours of freedom. All 3 had been doing time for violent crimes. And WBZ's Mike Macklin says anytime there's a prison break, it's a tense time for area residents.
Freedom was short-lived for the 3 escapees who broke out of the Southeastern Correctional Center in Bridgewater. All 3 were back in custody less than 12 hours after they made their daring getaway. The 3 cons, all serving time for violent crimes, were captured when state police and corrections officers burst into this New Bedford apartment where the trio had spent the night with Tammy Medeiros, an acquaintance of one of them.
They went to run, but of course there was about 8 cops, I guess, somewhere around there. They grabbed them, put them on the floor, slammed them around, put handcuffs on them, and still kept beating them.
Did they say anything to you?
No, not a word.
23-year-old Robert Martin of Rhode Island was serving 5 to 10 years for armed robbery. 20-year-old RICARDO Borges of Portugal was serving time for assault and battery and burglary. And 21-year-old Jason Costa of Acushnet was doing 8 to 10 years for armed robbery. The 3 cons escaped through the ceiling of a cell on the top floor of the century-old prison.
The inmates managed to use some homemade tools that they had fashioned by breaking through the roof of the facility, as well as just the ceiling in their cell. About a 10-inch space between those two, the ceiling and the roof. Climbed out through the hole, across the roof, makeshift rope made out of some bed sheets and pillowcases that were tied together. They managed to tie it to a standpipe, which was on the roof of the facility, and climbed down it.
That 4th tier is less secure than we had thought in the past, so we're in the process now of evaluating the situation. Obviously, it shows the need for a capital plan so we can replace these 125-year-old cells with new state-of-the-art construction.
When they discovered the inmates missing at the 9 o'clock head count, prison officials sounded the siren, alerting Bridgewater residents who lived nearby that there had been an escape.
They had actually come over here and were asking if we lived here and if they could come in and check the house. They had walked all around the area, knocking on doors and checking around.
Back in custody, the escapees were taken to MCI Cedar Junction, the state's maximum security prison in Walpole. Escaping from here will be a lot more difficult. Mike Macklin, WBZ News 4.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Eye Opener. It's Wednesday, November 1st. While you were sleeping, there was a massive overnight move of several hundred Bay State prisoners. News Center 5's Gail Huff is live in our newsroom. She has exclusive details now. Gail?
Good morning, Jim. We're told that the caravan of prisoners is headed north on the expressway at this hour. Now, this is highly unusual. It is not unusual to take prisoners out of one prison and transfer them to another prison in state, but very unusual to take them out of state. However, as many of you probably know, there is an overcrowding problem in Massachusetts, so this is in hopes of alleviating some of that problem. Now, the scuffle, or I should say shuffle around the state that often takes place of prisoners is something that happens maybe once every couple months. But this is something that we haven't seen the likes of before.
It was a hush-hush operation amid extremely tight security. Corrections officials began loading prisoners onto vans late last night. Handcuffed one after another, prisoners were brought out of the prison and loaded into vans that lined their way all around the prison grounds. Tony Carnevale, Public Relations Director for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, says about 300 prisoners are being transferred out of state. For security reasons, officials wouldn't reveal which state they're headed for. The motorcade is being led by the Mass State Police. The move to transport prisoners out of state is one to help alleviate the prison overcrowding problem here in Massachusetts. As the number of inmates has grown, prison space has become very scarce. Beacon Hill lawmakers have worked to get a new prison built in the Bay State, but amid scarce tax dollars, there's been little support.
Now, we've been told by Massachusetts correction officials that at 9 o'clock this morning they will have a press conference and they will be releasing details. Again, what we do know is that there are at least 300 prisoners that are headed out of state. They could be headed to the airport at this point. We'll have more details, of course, as they become available this morning. Jim?
Gail, any indication, is this the end of this transfer of all of the prisoners that are going to be been moved by now?
This is the end of the transfer from Norfolk, but this all came as a surprise. I mean, none of this was announced. We had no idea that this was going to be happening. In fact, I spoke with police departments in the area surrounding Norfolk, and they had not been notified either. So this is something they keep very quiet because of security concerns. So we don't know if there are any plans to transfer prisoners from other prisons or not.
100 inmates were moved during the night and taken to Logan Airport, where they will be taken to other prison facilities. Corrections Department spokesman Tony Cardovalli told us the move had been planned. He would not say where the prisoners are going, just that they will be flying out of Logan Airport. A news conference on this operation is scheduled for later this morning.
6:35, more now on the story we told you about a few minutes ago during traffic. In a highly unusual move, hundreds of Bay State inmates are moved out of state this morning. This was the scene about 5 o'clock. 300 medium security inmates taken from their beds and driven by van to Logan Airport under heavy security. Sources tell 7 News they're being flown out of state to ease the Bay State's overcrowding crisis. We have talked to prison officials in Texas who say the inmates are being taken to a county jail near Dallas. The move took place without incident. It was kept secret for security reasons. We know that the Department of Corrections is scheduled to hold a news conference this morning to talk about prison overcrowding and this morning's move.
Overcrowded prisons are less crowded today. The state has shipped 300 inmates off to Texas. A Texas jail with rooms for rent is taking our convicts in as part of a multi-million-dollar deal. WBZ's Shelby Scott joins us now from Concord Prison, where details of the inmate exodus were announced this morning. Shelby?
Uma, Texas has too many jail beds. Massachusetts doesn't have enough. In fact, Texas was actually advertising to other states to bring in your prisoners. We can handle it. Well, today, almost 300 Massachusetts inmates were moved in what was described as a massive operation. It happened under the cover of darkness, beginning out at the Gardner prison about 10:30 last night, with a rendezvous at the Norfolk jail at 4:15 this morning, and then on to Logan Airport. 299 medium security prisoners were being moved to the Dallas, Texas County Jail because of what officials say is severe overcrowding here in the Bay State.
It allows some wiggle room. It allows a few empty beds that we haven't had up to date. We've continuously been putting more and more inmates in areas that weren't designed to house these type of inmates.
The prisoners with guards and medical staff were boarded on a chartered jet. The inmates came from prisons in Gardner, Shirley, Norfolk, and Old Colony in Southeastern, both in Bridgewater. They were chosen because they had more than a year to serve and had no serious medical problems. The cost in Texas is $42 a day per inmate, about half what it costs here. But what's the total cost?
Costs all rolled into, in terms of the operational cost, the rate of incarceration cost, is approximately $4.5 to $5 million through the end of the fiscal year. Even when you roll those costs into their cost of incarceration, we're still at about half the cost of incarceration here. We believe it is a cost-effective, short-term solution.
The contract with the the Dallas County Jail runs from 1 year, November 1st of this year till November 1st of next year. Corrections officials say they have no plans to move any other inmates down to Texas. Those same officials tell us they have been notifying the relatives of prisoners, but they admit a lot of those relatives won't have the money to visit down in Texas. From outside the Concord prison, I'm Shelby Scott. Uma?
Shelby, this highly unusual move raises lots of questions. Specifically, we were told that this was not a cost-cutting move, but to quiet tensions in some of the prisons.
That's right. They're so overcrowded. You know, there was the uprising in Shirley not that long ago. They had hoped to move some modular units in there, but that would have just created more problems. It's the medium security beds, the people that have to stay behind fences, stay behind bars. that they're really lacking, and that's the big problem.
And as you mentioned, this has come as a surprise for so many of the families as well.
No one knew. The inmates that were being moved were awakened last night and told, they were shaken down and then told, you're going to Texas, and that's how the inmates found out.
All right, Shelby Scott, thank you for that update. Now, a hotline number has been set up for families to find out if a relative was transferred. That number is 617-524-9860.
Well, nearly 300 Massachusetts prisoners are settling in Texas this midday in a highly unusual effort to reduce inmate overcrowding in the Bay State. They were shipped out under the cover of darkness early this morning. Correction officials explained the transfer in a news conference this morning in Concord, and that's where News Center 5's Beth Germano standing by live now with the details. Beth?
Good afternoon, Jim. To be exact, 299 inmates will soon be landing in Dallas as part of a year-long contract Massachusetts now has with the state of Texas. You can imagine the inmates' surprise when they were rounded up starting at about 10 o'clock last night and told they were heading south. The cost of this whole thing, about $5 million. That's half, officials say, what it would cost if those inmates stayed here in Massachusetts. But it's more than just economics. They say it's public safety. In the dead of night, they were transported under heavy guard. A convoy of more than 40 vehicles en route to Logan Airport, destination Dallas.
We are in dire straits here at 170% overcrowded in medium security facilities. I do not need another Shirley where I endanger staff and endanger inmate lives.
At MCI Shirley, tensions led to a prison riot last August. Massachusetts jails say officials are practically standing room only with inmates double bunked, and there are court orders to get the numbers down. Last night they moved inmates that run the gamut from sex offenders to drug dealers. Desperate times, they say, call for creative measures.
I can assure you, Mr. Krikorian and I have been out beating the bushes and talking to sheriffs and everyone else. We have not found one medium bed.
The overnight operation was 5 weeks in the making, with an open invitation from Dallas to fill up their county jails that are overbuilt and half empty. At a cost of $42 per inmate per day, Massachusetts says it's a savings. But there may be another price to pay, with inmate families just as surprised at the move as the prisoners themselves.
We are, as we speak, notifying those individuals that their loved one is on a plane to Dallas. After that, we obviously will be listening to what they have to say. I can't tell you what we're going to do in terms of arranging visits and that type of stuff.
Very difficult when you send prisoners out of state. There's a management issue. There's civil rights and other litigation. The prisoners themselves tend not to behave well when they go out of state. And another issue is the fact that we're treating them basically as a commodity, and I think that's the wrong thing to do.
Officials say they can no longer depend on a slow-moving bond bill on Beacon Hill for new prison construction in Massachusetts. They now have a little bit of wiggle room, they call it, to move some inmates around in their 10,000 inmate population. Reporting live from Concord, I'm Beth Germano, News Center 5. Susan, back to you.
Calls it a transfer, but the family of one of those prisoners is calling it a kidnapping. We'll take a look right now at pictures of Massachusetts prisoners arriving in Dallas today with shackles on their feet, handcuffs on their wrists. They were led from a bus and into the Dallas County Jail, their new home. Back in Massachusetts, families are outraged.
I think that's as big a crime as any crime that anyone that was in there has committed. And the state did this. They did it to my son.
My husband has no possible way whatsoever to even get a lawyer to try to help him in the situation that he's in. Now they've taken him all the way down to Dallas, Texas, that I'm unable to even go see him.
The Corrections Department has set up a hotline for people to call to find out if a family member was transferred to Dallas. That number is 617-524-9860.
Good afternoon. A surprise and secret transfer for 300 Massachusetts prison inmates. They were rousted in the middle of the night and sent to Texas.
It is all part of a plan to ease the state's prison overcrowding problem. We get the latest on the midnight move from News Center 5's Beth Germano. Beth is standing by in Cambridge, where relatives of the prisoners are outraged and are meeting at this time. Beth?
Well, good evening, Natalie. The American Friends Service Committee here in Cambridge is one of the prisoner advocacy groups who held a press conference a short time ago calling this whole operation extreme. 299 inmates from 5 medium security facilities arrived in Dallas this morning as part of a new year-long contract Massachusetts has with the state of Texas. You can imagine the inmates' surprise when they were rounded up starting about 10 o'clock last night and told they were headed south. A convoy of more than 40 vehicles pulled out of MCI Norfolk early this morning under the cover of darkness under heavy guard. Destination, Dallas.
We are in dire straits here at 170% overcrowded in medium security facilities.
With cells throughout the system that look like this, double bunked and jam-packed. But in Dallas, the prison system is overbuilt and under capacity. They've been advertising available space.
It allows some wiggle room. It allows a few empty beds that we haven't had.
But Patricia Milley is left behind. She's the wife of an MCI Shirley prisoner, married 2 years ago to her husband John while he was already incarcerated on a rape conviction. She depends on weekly visits and heard about his transport on the morning news.
And I said, just tell me where my husband is. And they said that he was in Dallas, Texas. How am I supposed to get down there to see him? How's my mother-in-law supposed to see him?
Hey, kid, you're going south. Imagine how they felt. It's worse than the Gestapo, as far as I'm concerned.
Officials say even at $5 million for a year, this operation is economical, and they couldn't get help from Beacon Hill, where Governor Weld's prison construction bill is only inching along.
This sells well if an argument can be made that if he didn't have this option, he would have to release these prisoners to the general public.
While these prisoners are said to have no special medical or housing concerns, no pending court cases, Patricia Milley says these papers represent a 2-year battle to win her husband a new trial. Now he's hundreds of miles away.
And I choose to stick by somebody that's innocent, that he's loyal.
Now, corrections officials say as far as they're concerned, this operation is over. They have no more plans to transport any more prisoners, but they have to deal with a lot of irate families right now. Patricia Milley says she's been told she cannot contact her husband. He will have to contact her, or she will have to hear from him by letter. Reporting live from Cambridge, I'm Beth Germano, News Center 5. Chet, back to you.
All right, Beth, continuing coverage of this story tonight at 6. We'll have more reaction from relatives of the prisoners who've been transferred to Texas. Almost 300 Massachusetts convicts will be wintering south this year. In a story reported first on News Center 5 this morning, the inmates were rousted from their cells and flown to Dallas, Texas early this morning. Human rights advocates are calling it inhumane. Continuing coverage now with News Center 5's Ron Golleben, who reports that prison officials call it the only option they had to ease prison overcrowding.
Corrections officials say their surprise roundup overnight of 299 inmates from 5 prisons was made necessary by an acute shortage of beds to house a growing population, which has led to uprisings and lockdowns in recent months. The inmates were roused from their sleep under heavy guard and packed aboard a transport plane for Dallas, Texas, where they will be incarcerated.
We've continuously been putting more and more inmates in areas that weren't designed to house these type of inmates.
Last night's scenario was played out against a $750 million prison bill issue, which has been stalled on Beacon Hill for 4 years, while the inmate population has expanded beyond court-ordered limits. The move will make it more difficult for families to visit inmates and was criticized by the American Friends Service Committee.
The claim that the prisons are overcrowded to the degree that we have an emergency is largely a creation on the part of the department.
One legislator charged there were 500 available beds in the system and that this move was unnecessary. Correction officials call that charge untrue.
I can assure you, Mr. Krikorian and I have been out beating the bushes and talking to sheriffs and everyone else. We have not found one medium bed.
The move last night is expected to cost the state about $4.5 to $5 million, including future transportation and per diem expenses for the inmates. But corrections officials said this was not done for cost, but for safety. The increase in state mandatory minimum sentencing and the cry for longer sentences have burdened the correction system to the point that insiders have worried publicly about safety of both inmates and the staff as more and more of the prisons become overcrowded. Natalie?
Back home. Well, tonight, family members are having their say. UPN 38 reporter Tracy Grant joins us live from Cambridge with more. Tracy?
Lila, the building right behind me here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, houses the American Friends Service Committee. Just a short while ago, they had a meeting with the relatives of Massachusetts inmates. Of course, the main topic of discussion was the 299 inmates that were relocated early this morning to the Dallas County Jail.
The last time I talked to him was Monday, and he told me that he'd see me Thursday, that everything should be back to normal at MCI Shirley.
Patricia Milley didn't know it, but by the time she woke up early Tuesday morning, her husband John was gone, shipped off with 299 other inmates to the Dallas County Jail.
Just tell me where my husband is. And he says, yes, he was one of the inmates that was sent to Dallas. But I don't understand why.
That's what she asked officials at the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. They say they moved the inmates in response to the overcrowding problem. She says they've cut off her husband's lifeline. She and other family members have visited him at MCI Shirley up to 4 times a week since his rape conviction 2.5 years ago.
What does he get to live for? There's nothing. What do I get to live for? I have nothing. I can't see my son. I can't afford to go to Texas. I'll probably be dead by the time he gets out.
This type of a sudden move also poses problems for attorneys who are working on appeals to overturn their clients' convictions.
It's extremely important that counsel, the attorney, have access, reasonable access to his client at all reasonable times. Of course, it's inherently totally unreasonable to have your client in Texas.
Patricia Milley says her horror has just begun. Given only an address to write her husband, she says she can only imagine what his conditions are like. But she says her fear can't compare to his.
He's so scared. I know he is. I know he's so scared.
The people who attended this meeting this evening weren't necessarily all related to prisoners who were moved late last night, but they are all affiliated with Massachusetts inmates, and they all say they know exactly what it's like to have someone they love on the inside. American Friends Service Committee says they're discussing possible recourse to this action. They say they'll appeal to Governor Weld. They'll ask anyone who listened to help them.
Tracy, is there a number people can call? How can people find out if their relatives have been sent south?
Well, right now we've been told that there is no official list available to the public, but the woman we talked to in our story found out about her husband by making several calls to the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, and at this point that's really the only viable way to get information.
Tracy Grant reporting from Cambridge. Thank you for that report. Roy?
Defense attorneys are preparing to file lawsuits challenging the transfer this week of 299 inmates from Massachusetts prisons to Texas.
They say prison officials broke their own rules when they transferred the inmates. Tonight, a discussion of the transfer. Joining us is Tony Carnevale. He is Director of Public Affairs for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. Also joining us is Peter Alican. He's a criminal defense attorney, a former television news reporter. He's author of a book on prison overcrowding that is due out next fall. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the issue being raised. One lawyer for one of the defendants is saying that one of the inmates is saying this is illegal. You violated your own rules by that. Specifically, what does the law state?
The Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Department of Correction has the ability to transfer an inmate to another correctional facility prior to a hearing being held in the interest of public safety, and if it's a security issue. The inmate activists and attorneys are raising the issue, saying that a hearing should have been held prior to the transfer. It's specifically stated in Commonwealth of Massachusetts regulations that if it's a security issue, an inmate can be transferred prior to a hearing as long as that hearing is held within 20 working days. We're in the process of sending a team down to Texas to conduct those hearings. They will be done.
But you had loads of notice. This is no surprise. The prisons have been overcrowded for quite a period of time now, and I think you can only really transfer them without a hearing. If there's an emergency situation, you knew about it. This summer we probably had the highest overcrowding that there's ever been. Obviously, you had plenty of advance notice on this. You had to make plans to fly people out, to charter a plane, to have a contract with Texas. Why in the middle of the night, no warning, don't let the legislators know who are in charge of overseeing the system? Why would it be done under cover of darkness without any notice?
Well, Counselor, can you imagine the chaos that would ensue if this was announced publicly beforehand with medium security inmates, sex offenders, violent offenders that are required to be in a facility with a wall and a fence? Can you imagine the chaos with inmate advocates laying down in front of the caravan as it headed out to the prison, with other people trying to break their loved one or whatever issue they might have with trying to disrupt the caravan, trying to free someone. Can you imagine what would ensue if this was made public beforehand? And again, we have the right to make the transfer if it's a security concern.
Do you think this was necessary in the first place, or as some critics suggest, do you think this was a political move by the Weld administration?
It was absolutely a political move. It makes great headlines. Obviously, as we know, there's no constituency out there for prisoners. I've never heard of a politician running on a pro-prisoner platform. So you can always score points if you do anything mean-spirited to prisoners. You can come in the middle of the night with dogs and pretty much kidnap them out of the state. And there's really, I don't think that you lose that many points with the public that much.
But aren't people saying it's mean-spirited to have them double bunked and locked down? Aren't we doing them a favor by at least getting them out of this tremendously overcrowded situation?
I don't think there's a single prisoner who would agree with that it was a favor done to them. But I wouldn't even want to argue this point so much by arguing, gee, the prisoners are upset, gee, they're not comfortable doing this, because I don't think, as I said, the public really has an interest in this. I have two particular interests. One is that, what about their families? What about the 3-year-olds and the 7-year-olds who aren't going to see daddy for a few years, maybe, who can't afford to get out there, or somebody with an elderly, sick mother? I mean, to pull people out of families, and it's really a victimization of the families. Why should they be punished? But that's not the main problem. To me, the main problem is when you take prisoners, you treat them like animals, you don't rehabilitate them, you throw them in these cells, and it's kind of a hot little pressure cooker of a crime school there in prison, and you also don't let them have contacts with people like their family. I think that promotes crime. That's why I say it's a soft-on-crime problem. I think it's very important that we not have people in these, as I call them, pressure cookers, and then for years, and then throw them out onto society again, because it's a danger to us. I think it's very important that they have connections with family, the people on the outside. It helps them make the transition back to society. Therefore, I'm arguing that it's safer to the public. What was done to the prisoners here endangers the public, and it's ultimately soft on crime.
Absolutely, some of this has to be responded to. Let's remember that committing a crime and landing in prison is what takes you away from a family. Secondly, if we want to get into the issue of inmates are the ones that brought lawsuits to reduce overcrowding within prison facilities. Inmates brought the lawsuits. A court ordered us to reduce the prison population at MCI Concord. Inmates brought lawsuits because of the use of chemical toilets at a 140-year-old prison. Those inmates don't want to be in that kind of a condition. A court ordered us to deal with that issue, and we need to deal with that.
So you retaliated against them in the most mean way, rather than there's room for them here in the state.
That's an issue. The last time you were here, you were talking about overcrowding, no beds available, and a woman from the American Friends Service Committee said, the last time I talked with you, you told me you had beds available.
I explained to you those beds are available at minimum and pre-release level facilities with no walls or fences around them. The offenders that we moved to Texas are medium security inmates. The majority of them are sex offenders who have failed and refused.
The majority of the people, of those 299 who were sent there, were sex offenders.
Sex offenders who have failed and completely refused to take part in sex offender treatment programs. Now, were we to take those inmates and put them in a community, in a facility without a wall or a fence, the show tomorrow would be, how dare the Department of Correction put the public at risk by putting a sex offender who has not been treated and refuses to address their crime. Why are we putting them in the community,
that just
and
isn't
putting the
so,
community at risk?
There were secure facilities. What about Plymouth? They said they could make room for 140 beds. I think that's a phony issue. It's a smokescreen to say, well, we'd have to put them out in a place where there's no fences and the sex offenders can simply go out into the community. I think that's really just not honest.
And I would like to know, do you have a breakdown of what they were convicted of? I mean, you said the majority were sex offenders.
Slightly more than half were sex offenders. The main criteria is that these inmates are at the medium security level. They have to stay behind a wall or a fence because they have no prospect of moving to a lower level of security. And reasons that can happen can be if you're a sex offender who is declining to take part in therapy or address your crime, or if you're an inmate with an Immigration or Naturalization Service issue, an INS issue. You're an illegal, in other words, and when you complete serving your state sentence, you're going to be deported, or at least you're going to go into federal custody for possible deportation.
How long do you
people we're talking about.
How long do you anticipate them being in Texas?
We have a 1-year contract with the state of Texas.
But what about these people who really do have families back here? You're talking about returning people to society. Why send them 2,000 miles away?
Our intent was certainly not to break up families. That was not the intent.
But that's exactly what happens, right?
The Commissioner of Corrections did not wring his hands and say, what can I do to break up families? There is a very serious overcrowding problem. We had a riot at Shirley, $2.5 million in damage. I'd like to bring in here the officers that were locked into units with inmates attempting to get to them and attack them. Fortunately, no one was hurt or injured. Again, inmates brought lawsuits requiring us, the courts telling us we have to reduce overcrowding. This was a step that we had to take.
You picked the most expensive way and the most harmful way to do it. Out of all the different options for resolving prison overcrowding, this was bizarre.
We have a documented record of looking within Massachusetts for prison space. We talked to the County of Plymouth, and I will show you numerous newspaper articles where the person that we heard from earlier, the county commissioner, is quoted as saying that they do not want these prison inmates, state prison inmates, at that facility. The county sheriff had concerns at that time that there was some construction concerns with that facility, that we could not move the inmates in there. If that has since changed, if this whole issue has put that back on the table and Plymouth has beds for us, we need many more, and we'll talk to them again, and I'm sure we can find inmates that will move there as well.
Texas is 2,000 miles away. Did we check with every other state, a little bit closer by for the family concerns, or why Texas?
The New England states are in the same situation that we are in terms of overcrowding. We looked at Rhode Island. There's a privately owned facility there. There's a state law that does not allow us to contract with Rhode Island for bed space. We've done everything possible, and we have a documented record over this summer of looking for other facilities to do this, and the beds are just not there.
You didn't air this with the legislators. A lot of people could have gotten involved in looking at options. Why was this done absolute secret, behind closed doors, not letting the legislators who oversee corrections know? You didn't let anybody know. I don't think there was any need for this secrecy. Maybe if you had a little sunlight into this, there could have been a lot more options explored. We don't even know what options you did. You did it under cloak.
The legislature has had 4 years to pass a prison capital plan. We have sites located. We have communities that have said, yes, we will accept the prison. For 4 years, our capital plan has sat with the legislature, and the House leadership is refusing to release that bill.
So that's why you keep them in the dark? Part of this?
Absolutely not. Again, this is a life and a safety and a security issue for our staff primarily, and as well for the inmates.
And you didn't have 24 hours notice on this. Didn't you know that the staff has been endangered for years? You couldn't have even told anybody a week ago, or while you were making the plans to move them to Texas, while you were chartering planes? You couldn't have let anybody know about this?
I'll get back to the issue again of safety and security. Can you imagine what would happen if people had knowledge of this ahead of time, people who are seeking to break their loved ones loose, laying down in front of the vans that were transporting inmates before this happened? Can you just, you're concerned about the life and safety of inmates. Can you imagine what would have happened?
I don't mean to offend you, but you're very good at using the buzzword, safety and security, sex offenders. Nobody wants them in their communities. And I really would like to see the numbers on that, so I'll follow up on that. But would we even be discussing this? Would this move have been made if not the governor were considering a run for the Senate next month?
These plans were in the works. This was at least 5 weeks.
It makes great headlines, getting tough on criminals. It makes the legislature look bad. I haven't been able to do this because they wouldn't cooperate with me.
This was prepared for at least 5 weeks, long before there's been any discussion publicly. We don't know what the governor's plans were. The Commissioner of Corrections is the authority here. He's the one that signs off on these transfers, and he is the one that conducted that.
It's easy to make these criticisms to sort of stand outside and throw stones at what the administration's doing, but in the position that they are claiming to be, where it's an immediate safety issue, not one of these policy things that we have 5 years to work out, what would you have done with these 300 inmates? How would you have equalized the system and stopped the lawsuits and made it safe for everyone?
I think that you're always going to wind up with these Band-Aid approaches to prison overcrowding. You're going to want to keep building more and more and more prisons, and we can't build our way out of it. It's going to get so bad, you send them to other states, and they keep coming and coming and coming. I think that we really have to look toward the causes of crime and to rehabilitation of prisoners, and I think that doesn't make for a handy bumper sticker slogan.
But how about this time? How about this week? The decision that the administration faced. What do you do?
It was overclassification. There was room here within the state of Massachusetts to take care of this particular problem.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it on that point. Gentlemen, thank you both. Peter Ellick and Tony Carnevale, thank you for being with us tonight. In a moment, a preview of this weekend's New England Auto Show when we come back.
Other news now, the search continues tonight for 2 prison escapees in Bridgewater who are also suspects in a home invasion there. The 2 men walked away from the minimum security Southeastern Correction Center on Thursday and last night allegedly broke into a Bridgewater home looking for cash and clothes. They also found something they never expected. Shortly after Richard Mack answered the knock at his door last night, 2 men burst into his home, tied up Mack and his 3-year-old son. Authorities say the invaders were David Lefebvre and Raymond Wagner, who escaped from a Bridgewater Correctional Facility on Thursday night.
They tied him up, and they were in the house for approximately 20 minutes, during which time they stole food, stole clothing. While they were stealing the clothing, they observed Department of Corrections uniforms.
Realizing they had broken into the home of a corrections officer, the men quickly fled, stealing Mack's car. Mack was able to struggle free, but with the phone lines cut, he had to run to a neighbor's to call police. Did he tell you anything about what had happened?
That they had just come in and they grabbed the baby first. And so naturally, he's a big man, and he couldn't do anything because he didn't want to take chances with the baby.
This is the second time 2 inmates have escaped from this correctional complex in just the last year and a half. It was Halloween night 1993 when 2 convicted murderers escaped from here. In that case, the inmates escaped from the medium security Old Colony Prison by climbing the fence at a blind spot near the guard tower and past malfunctioning motion detectors. They were caught a month later. Lefebvre and Wagner simply walked away from a minimum security facility with no walls, no fences. They were close to their release date and not considered dangerous.
We have to reevaluate that now. Obviously, they invaded a home and tied a person up and his son, so at this point in time, we would consider them at least dangerous.
Now, both Mack and his 3-year-old son were not injured. Lefebvre and Wagner were being held on minor burglary and robbery charges. The search for them continues.
Authorities south of Boston are searching for a pair of prison escapees who broke into a correction officer's home. 27-year-old David Lefebvre and 25-year-old Raymond Wagner walked away from a minimum security facility at Bridgewater on Thursday. The pair made their way to a home some miles away and tied up homeowner Rick Mack and his 3-year-old son. But as they ransacked the house, the fugitives spotted Mack's corrections uniform. They dropped everything, grabbed some cash, and took off in Mack's car.
Fortunately, it was that kind of a situation where the officer, with some training, was able to act professionally, was able to recognize one of the individuals, although he might not have had direct contact with him as of late because he works in a different part of that prison. He did recognize one of the inmates and, with his training, was able to cooperate with the police in the investigation.
Neither Mack nor his son were injured in the invasion, but as a precaution, correction officers will be posted at the home for the remainder of the weekend.
A frightening scene at a Bridgewater prison. A guard is held hostage for hours. Fox News Boston reporter Bob Ward joins us now live from the scene. Bob.
Dave, both the hostage and the inmate are okay at this hour. This drama ended, I should say, at about 5 minutes of 7. But just a few moments ago, officials here finally told the press what had taken place. And it is clear that there were some very tense moments here in Bridgewater tonight. Now, the inmate is identified as MacArthur Denson. And at about 3:45, he took a counselor hostage here at the treatment center for the sexually dangerous. Denson is serving an 18 to 25-year sentence for aggravated rape. Officials say this was a regular appointment with his counselor when he suddenly barricaded himself in her office. The entire facility was ordered into a lockdown, and negotiators started talking to Denson. At 6:55, the hostage was released, but there's a mystery. There's no motive, and no one is sure if the suspect even had a weapon.
He never was specific with his demands. I think that further investigation will have the results of that, but it's unclear to me, even at this time, whether or not he had any specific demands.
Did he say he... Inmate Denson is 33 years old. We hear that he is from Springfield. He will be arraigned in the morning at Brockton District Court. We'll have much more on this a little bit later in our newscast. Reporting live from Bridgewater, Bob Ward, Fox News Boston.
Thank you, Rondella. Tonight, the largest state prison complex in Massachusetts is under a lockdown. An inmate at the Center for the Sexually Dangerous in Bridgewater held a female therapist hostage for nearly 3 hours. The News Center 5's David Ropeek reports finally she was freed.
Inmates at Bridgewater's Hospital for the Criminally Insane and the State Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous often meet privately with their therapists. 33-year-old MacArthur Denson of Springfield, who had served 16 years of an 18 to 25-year sentence for aggravated rape, was in such a meeting with his therapist this afternoon when he barricaded the office door from the inside and took her hostage.
By 6:50 p.m., just before 7 o'clock this evening, the victim was released by the inmate, and the inmate did surrender without a struggle to authorities.
We haven't uncovered a weapon yet. The area has been secured as a crime scene. We're in the process now of searching it. Naturally, we took the victim right out, and we've sent her out to a hospital to be evaluated.
Denson told negotiators he would not harm the woman, who remained calm and helped end things safely.
She deserves a lot of credit. She did a very good job on the inside, dealing with the inmate to bring this to some closure.
All 5,000 inmates at the 5 facilities on the Bridgewater campus remain locked down tonight and will indefinitely until the investigation into the hostage-taking concludes. Denson will be arraigned tomorrow. It is unclear at this point what additional charges he will face. In Bridgewater, David Ropeek, News Center 5 tonight.
Relief tonight at the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous. A therapist who was held hostage by an inmate is now safe. News 4's David Robichaud is standing by live in Bridgewater with the story. David?
Liz, they're in a lockdown situation right now. The situation is over, but earlier this afternoon, it was a very, very tense situation here down in Bridgewater. Now, about 3:45, a female therapist was conducting an interview session with a 33-year-old convicted rapist. They were in an office inside a building where there were guards in the corridor, but no guards in the room, and the inmate was not restrained in any way. At some point, he barricaded the door, and even though they're calling this a hostage situation, officials say he made no specific demands. He apparently showed no weapon. Now, hostage negotiators were sent. They were talking to the inmate through the door and over the phone. After about 3 hours, he gave up. The therapist was taken to a local hospital. Now, late tonight, prison officials held a news conference. I asked if it was unusual if the female counselor was to be left in a room alone with a convicted rapist.
No, it's not uncommon for individuals to be alone with inmates. You know, corrections is a dangerous business, and people who work behind the walls, whether, you know, they're correction officers, clerical, or therapists, as in this case, frequently have one-on-one contact with inmates.
Now, officials say the therapist showed no physical signs of any injury or trauma, but they are interviewing her on whether or not she was sexually assaulted by that inmate. As for the inmate, he's been transferred to MCI Cedar Junction in Walpole. He faces arraignment tomorrow on various charges in Brockton District Court. Live in Bridgewater, I'm David Robichaud, News 4 New England.